All right, well, last week we started the book of Galatians, and we looked at chapter 1 last week. Today we're going to look at chapter 2. Last week we talked about the grace of God, and we saw that this was Paul's passion. He wanted to make sure that the grace of God was understood and lived out by the Galatians. And grace, we saw, is the concept of a gift. And we talked a little bit about what that meant. And hopefully you're taking the challenge and you're reading through. And this week, hopefully you'll grab that youth guide and go through chapter 2 or follow along in your workbooks. But today, the theme in chapter 2, as we continue on in the book, the theme is going to be integrity. Now, maybe when you hear the word integrity, you're thinking, oh, great, my parents talked to me about that, or my teachers talked to me about integrity. But I want you to think about integrity a little bit differently today. Integrity, actually, that word comes from the same word for integer, which is a math word. Now, if you know what an integer is, it's a whole number, and that's what integrity means. Integrity is about being whole. It's about being undivided. That's what integrity is. So if a person has integrity, think about that. A person having integrity means he's the same person no matter who he's in front of. He's the same person in front of you as he is in front of his other buddies, or as he is in front of his parents or his teachers or the principal or whatever. So a person of integrity is someone who is whole, who's the same everywhere. You'll talk about that a little bit later on in your groups. But if you think about the integrity of a building, it means that it is whole and reliable, and it's structurally, it's not going to fall down. So if you know any structural engineers, that they love this word integrity, because integrity means it's whole, it's not easily divided, it's not going to crumble apart. That's what integrity means with that. And today we're going to talk a little bit about integrity when it comes to the message of the gospel. See, in chapter 2, we're going to see that one of Paul's concerns is that this message maintains its integrity. That the message that he had learned is whole and undivided in the same message that the other apostles are teaching and that we teach today, 2,000 years ago. And so we're going to look at this idea of integrity. Now, last week we had some geography lessons, and this week we're going to have a history lesson. Let's start with Paul's story. We looked into it a little bit last week. Paul's story is one of the greatest stories of all time. We already saw this in Galatians 1:13. He said, "You know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion," when he was a Pharisee. He said, "how I violently persecuted the church of God, and I did my best to destroy it. I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the traditions of my ancestors." And so Paul was very zealous. That word means that he was really passionate, almost a little bit crazy about what he believed in. Now, I can relate to this. I don't know if you can too, but when I was young, I was actually pretty zealous when it came to some of the things that I believed, and I was all into it. In fact, my mom said that when I was in grade school on the elementary playground, that one time a teacher told her that I was yelling at the other kids for throwing snowballs in God's world. Now, I don't really know what my deal was with snowballs, but apparently I had a lot of zeal as a youngster. I was one of those kids that believed what I heard at church and what I learned, even if some of the things that I learned weren't all the way true. Now, most of the stuff that I learned was, but every once in a while you'll hear something that you latch onto, and you realize that your zeal for that thing, it was maybe a little bit misplaced. And this is what happened in Paul's story. So what happened is Paul is, in his zeal, he's going from one place to another place as a Jewish Pharisee to persecute the Christians in his day, because he thought they were wrong. He thought they were on the wrong side. So he was going to persecute them, and it was there that you can read about this in Acts chapter 9. It's there that he met Jesus. He had this conversion experience, this pretty cool experience, one of the coolest stories. Jesus came to Paul, he appeared to Paul, and he said, "Why are you persecuting me? Why are you picking on me, Paul?" And Paul realizes in that moment that he was wrong, and the Christians that he was going to persecute were the right ones. What an amazing revelation for Paul. I mean, this was a guy that trained, he studied, he was advancing in his career field among the Jews, and then he has this totally life-changing experience where he meets Jesus, and it totally changes everything that he thought. It's what we talked about last week. It was this new information that led to amazing transformation in his life. In fact, it says this in Acts 9, Saul stayed with the believers in Damascus for a few days, and immediately he began preaching about Jesus in the synagogues, saying this, "He is indeed the Son of God." So get this. Here this guy is. He's going to Damascus. Listen to this. This is kind of funny. He's going to Damascus to persecute the Christians there in the name of his Jewish religion. On the way there, he meets Jesus. Jesus says, "You're on the wrong side." He changes his mind, and now the business trip that was all about persecuting Christians, now he's hanging out with him, and he's having lunch with him. And now he's going around telling people, instead of telling people to stop believing in Jesus, he's going around telling people to start believing in Jesus. And he starts sharing this message of the grace of God. Like we saw last week, he becomes the greatest missionary to the Gentiles that the world has ever seen. That's Paul's amazing, incredible story. Now, I don't know about you, but do you realize how hard it is to change your mind about something? I mean, if you believe in something so confidently that you are like, I am positive that this thing is true, and then you learn something different. This is what happened to Paul. This is what happened to me when I was young. Some of that information that I had that was well-meaning and I was very zealous about, I learned later on in life that some of that stuff wasn't all the way true. I was actually somewhat legalistic as a young person. I drew hard lines on certain things, and I realized how hypocritical I was in those things. And it was very difficult for me to change my mind about that. I don't know if you can relate. Maybe there's something that your parents have been telling you to change, and you just don't want to change. Maybe you're in the middle of struggling with, you hear something from your friends at school, and you hear another thing at church, and you're in the middle of making this incredibly hard decision, and you want to follow that thing, but you know that this thing is right. Man, it is so hard to change your mind. It's so hard to do that. We're going to see what happened in this story. Here's the thing. This message that God revealed to Paul, this message of grace that we looked at last week, it turns out is the same message that God revealed to another leader in the church at that time, the guy by the name of Peter, one of Jesus' disciples. Peter learned the same thing Paul was learning. Peter learned it in almost as incredible a fashion. You can read about it in Acts chapter 10, but basically, let me just sum up what happened there. Peter is just kind of hanging out, minding his own business, and God gives Peter this vision. He drops this sheet down in front of Peter, and on the sheet is all of this food that Jews weren't supposed to eat, because if you were Jewish and Peter was Jewish, you weren't supposed to eat certain foods because it's just not what you did. For generations, you just didn't eat certain foods. It's just not what you ate, Like some of you can handle jalapenos because it's just part of your culture. But for some of us, man, our systems are too delicate. We can't handle that kind of stuff. Okay, don't make fun of us. It's just the way it is. Now, for the Jews, it was a little bit more significant than that because they believed that some food was clean to eat and some food was unclean, impure. And so in this vision, that this sheet comes down from heaven, and Peter sees all these foods that were unclean, that you're not supposed to eat if you're Jewish. And the voice from heaven said this, Peter, get up and eat. And Peter said, no, I'm not going to fall for this trick. I know we're not supposed to eat these things because it's unclean. And then the vision from heaven said this. The voice said in verse 15, do not call something unclean if God has made it clean. And the same vision, it says, was repeated 3 times, and then the sheet was suddenly pulled up from heaven. Here's what happened. It turns out this vision wasn't about food, it was about people. And God was trying to teach Peter the same message that he was teaching Paul. He said this, you are not clean and unclean based on what you do. That was a message we saw last week. And he was saying to this, Peter, God has decided to call the Gentiles clean. God has decided to let them in. God wants you to go tell them that. So you can go read it for yourself. Peter ends up going to the house of a guy named Cornelius who is not Jewish. And right after this vision, he shares that message. He shares that vision with Cornelius and this household. And Cornelius becomes the first non-Jewish person to become a Christian. And after that, many, many, many more people become a Christian. And it's all the same message we learned last week. It's this: you can be clean because of what Jesus did, not because of your tradition, not because whether you're Jewish or not. You can be clean on that basis alone. And this was a huge issue for them. This was the gospel answering this humongous debate that you can read about for yourself in Acts chapter 15. This big debate that we looked a little bit at last week. Does a Gentile have to become Jewish first to become Christian? Does a person have to jump through all these hoops to be saved? Does salvation equal faith plus works, or does salvation equals faith plus nothing? And the answer was, Paul's answer, it's faith plus nothing. There's nothing you can do but to trust in Jesus for your salvation. What a life-changing message. And here's where integrity comes into it. This was the same message that Peter and Paul preached. The integrity of that message was kept no matter who was sharing that message. So Peter went with the same message. Paul went with the same message. Every missionary after Acts chapter 15, every person who went out to share the gospel with people, they all went out on the same page with the same message. There's only one thing you can do, and it's to receive the free gift of God by putting your trust in Jesus Christ. That's the message. It's what we, 2,000 years later, call Foundations Truth number 1. We start by trusting Jesus. There's no other way to start. That's the integrity of the gospel message. That's the message that Martin Luther discovered in the 1500s when he read Galatians for himself, and he realized, the integrity of the message has been lost, and the Reformation started, and all of our lives have been changed as a result of that. And this same message is something that you need to understand and grasp and hold on to. And I want to close with this idea, the idea of your personal integrity. Because later on you're going to see what happens in Galatians chapter 2 as you read that, is that Peter started wavering on this message. Even Peter, even after this vision, he wavered on this message. You can read about it in Galatians 2, but basically what you'll read there is that Paul calls Peter out and he says, how can you waver on this message? How can you say one thing and act another way? And that's what he was doing. He was saying that he believed in this message, but because of his tradition, because it's so hard to change your mind about something, Peter had a hard time acting on it. I don't know if you can relate to that. Paul called out Peter's hypocrisy. You can read about it right there in Galatians chapter 2. Paul called out Peter's hypocrisy, and he says, do you believe it or not? Are you going to be the same person in front of me as you are in front of those Jewish people? Are you going to really believe it enough to let it change your life? And that's the question for us today as well. You know, for some of you, if you've received the message of Jesus Christ, that we're saved by Christ, the question is this: do you believe it enough to be the same person everywhere and to let that truth, God's word affect you, whether it's at home, at school, at church? Do you have that integrity? That's what you talk about in small groups this week.